What's going on, everyone? So we had a draft stream from FFG today, and we got a bunch of cards to talk about, like over 30 or something like that. Basically, finishing off the majority of the set that we have yet to see, which is going to be really exciting. And we're going to kind of speed run through a lot of these cards because there's so many of them. There's a few select ones that I'm really excited about, of course, to talk about a little bit more, but most of them are common or cards that I think are just kind of average. So big thank you to my patrons, but let's dive into this. Starting off with Sidon Ithano. So this is a brand new ground unit, 2-cost cunning 2/2, but when you play him as a unit, you can attach him as an upgrade to enemy vehicle unit without a pilot on it. So essentially, like a perilous position for your opponent's vehicles, but it doesn't exhaust them. It's kind of an interesting one. It kind of works for situations where, you're looking for some sort of interaction in cunning that isn't just necessarily bouncing, or maybe you're trying to shrink down a unit, or maybe you just get value from, getting a pilot on your opponent's units. I'm not 100% sure exactly where Sidon here would kind of fit in. Of course, he is simply a 2/2 if you do not get the when played effect. So your opponent kind of needs to have a vehicle unit, and they also need to not have already piloted onto that unit in order for this to even be good at all, or get the -2/-2 effect. Otherwise, you're just getting a 2-resource 2/2, which is horrible, like absolutely horrible. So I'm not sure about this one. Definitely an interesting one, and I think they're definitely going in some weird directions, which I think is really, really cool. But next up, we've got Close the Shield Gates, rather. 1-cost event in Vigilance is to choose a base. The next time damage will be dealt to it this phase, prevent that damage. Very interesting, and I think this does have some pretty interesting potential in controlling decks. You're really looking to avoid a big hit and then just basically heal, right? There was repair being played in a lot of set 1 control decks, like 1 to 2 copies, and that was heal 3. If this can heal more than that, essentially, or prevent more of damage than just 3, we could see it being played. I will say, if your opponent has multiple units, then they can always just attack with a smaller unit and then attack with their bigger unit. So there's a good chance that this can be played around. But I think that it's interesting, at least. I don't think it's like meta or anything. I don't think a repair was necessarily like a staple, but it was played somewhat in some of the hard control decks. Next up, we got Rebellious Hammerhead. This one's very interesting, actually, because we have a 6-cost space unit in Aggression Heroism with a 5/7 Rebel Vehicle Capital Ship. And it says, when play, you may deal damage to a unit equal to the number of cards in your hand. So the first thing is, we're playing Aggression Heroism. So if we're looking to get into the mid game and play like 6-resource 5/7 space units, we're looking at Ray Red, Anakin Blue, that type of stuff. And those decks don't really have a lot of cards in their hand when 6 drops come around. I could see this dealing at most like 5 damage, right? Comes down, deals 5 damage, and it's kind of like a wrecker, which is reasonable. But I would say most often it's going to deal 3 to 4. And then you're left behind with a 5/7 capital ship in space, which is a lot less threatening than a 7/6 wrecker. Although Wrecker has to defeat a resource, the overwhelm aspect actually ends the game quicker. The extra power actually ends the game quicker. I think that this card has maybe a little bit of potential because of the fact that it doesn't defeat a resource. But again, the lack of reliability and how much damage you're going to get, and the fact that it probably won't kill a unit when it comes down, is on the weaker side. So another common, another kind of average card. Next up is a card that I think is really good. We have a 1-cost event in Cunning Heroism. Very straightforward. Look at an opponent's hand and discard an event from it. This card is going to be a sideboard staple in those Cunning Heroism decks when you're fighting up against any of those decks that are really reliant on events. Of course, hard control decks are obvious, but oftentimes Spark of Rebellion is a card that's used to take those events from opponents' hands. Bodhi obviously does it in like Double Yellow Han, but Jam Communications definitely has a place in a lot of different decks, even necessarily or not necessarily in decks that already have like Bodhis and Sparks in their deck. But a really cheap way to interact and mess with your opponent's hand is really, really solid. And this is 1 resource. So I definitely think this has potential, but mainly as a sideboard card in certain matchups. Next up, we've got an interesting Vigilance removal option, a 5-cost event in Out the Airlock in Vigilance. It's give a unit -5/-5 for this phase. So an event that kind of gets through a lot of different things that are going to prevent your unit from dying. Shield tokens as a big one. This just cuts straight through them. It also cuts through like TIE Phantoms. It also cuts through anything that's going to prevent that unit from being defeated. If your opponent happens to have like a 2/2 space unit, I suppose Chewbacca being piloted onto that space unit wouldn't save it because it gives +3/+3. So then you could still go on and out the airlock the space unit, which I guess would happen. Unlikely. But this just basically handles all those weird scenarios like TIE Phantom. And I do think this has potential as maybe a sideboard option, or maybe as one of or two of. If there's a ton of different shielded units in the meta, I think this does have potential because you aren't damage based, although the takedowns and fellow dragons also work in those situations too, so maybe it's not necessarily that great, but it also has that versatility of not just being able to get around shields because it's not damage based, not just be limited by fell the dragon or anything like that where it's defeating a unit and some things avoid being defeated, but it also has that ability to take out and shrink things that maybe are outside of the range of a takedown or outside of the range of a fell the dragon, etc., which can be interesting. So I wouldn't be surprised if people try to experiment with one or two of these. I don't think it's that good, so we'll see. But one or two of is where I would be thinking, and probably in the sideboard or meta dependent. Next up, we've got Cloaked Star Viper, 4-cost space unit in Vigilance, the 3/2 underworld vehicle fighter. It's got give 2 shield tokens to this unit when it's played. Very weird unit. Very weird unit. It is a space unit, and in something like Gar-Sax, it is a 4/2 space unit with 2 shield tokens. That's kind of interesting, especially because 4 toughness, 4 power is really, really important to get through all the 4 toughness units out there. Heck, even like Oztag Liberator Gunship, which comes down on 4. We have 7th Fleet Defender, which is a 3/2 shielded, so this is going to cut through that eventually. We've got things like Punishing One, Millennium Falcon, which are 4 toughness. The fact that it's got that 4th power in like a Gar-Saxon makes it a little bit appealing. Outside of that, it's a 3/2. It's a 3/2. I mean, I don't really see it being all that useful. It dies to Perilous Position. It dies to any removal, essentially, like, unless it's damage based. And it's just going to take too long to actually get that value from the extra shield tokens, I'd say, oftentimes. Maybe I'll be wrong about this one. Maybe because Underworld has some viability, but I just don't see it really doing all that much. Next up, we've got Skyway Cloudcar, 3-cost ground unit in Cunning. It's a 3/3. When defeated, you may return a non-leader unit with 2 or less power to its owner's hand. So 3 resource, 3/3 ground unit is pretty mediocre. It's got a when defeated trigger, so like maybe we can do something with Thrawn, but 2 or less power is really not common. Even in space, like, yes, there's Cartel Spacers, there's Cartel Turncoats, but let's say you're playing a subpar unit in ground to deal with a not insanely impactful unit on your opponent's side of the field. I don't really think that's like an amazing payoff in best case scenarios, right? Like best case scenario, what this does, you play it, it trades with like a 4/3 ground unit, and then you get to bounce like their Cartel Spacer. Okay, that's pretty good, but that's like ultra best case scenario. There's not many stat lines that are like that. Most of the time it's 3/5, 3/4s, etc. So it's not really going to be able to compete in the ground. And you're also not going to find a lot of matchups where that 2 or less power is going to be relevant when this thing dies, right? Yes, there's Krennics, there's Crafty Smugglers and things like that, of course. But even then, it's not going to be all that common. So I can see this doing a little bit of work, and maybe you can get it down and Thrawn and hopefully bounce multiple things. But I think it's kind of just, again, another average common. Next up, we've got Wingguard Security Team. This one's pretty interesting because it's the first card that works with a tag that we haven't seen yet. It's a 6-cost ground unit in Vigilance. It's a 4/4 Sentinel. And it's got when played, give a shield token to each of up to 2 Fringe units. Now, it's really important because this is when played that we can actually go ahead and give the shield token to itself. So we can have a 4/4 shielded Sentinel and then another shield token for another Fringe unit. So Fringe is a trait that I was curious as to whether or not they're going to do anything with it. It's kind of interesting because Fringe is just going to be a conglomeration of kind of a bunch of random things, right? But it could bring about a pretty interesting style of deck. So I think that's what's cool about this. A 6 resource 4/4 Sentinel Shielded is just bad. It's just bad. We've seen like Super Commando, and that's okay in Gar Saxon. Even then, it's kind of mediocre. This is just not going to be playable. Even though you can get the other shield token to another Fringe unit, it's just like it doesn't make up for the stats that you're missing, the extra cost, the things you're competing with are just way too mediocre. So this is like definitely only draft type situation here. Next up, we've got Adept Arc 170. This is another one where I don't have to spend a lot of time talking about it. It's a 4-cost space unit in command. It's a 3/4 Republic vehicle fighter. It's got Restore 2. It's a Republic unit, which is kind of interesting. It's a pretty mediocre stat line. 4 resource 3/4. We have 3 resource space units that are 3/4s. Restore 2 is nice, but not enough to make up for the stat line. I don't think this card is very playable at all. We have Trace Martez. It's a 3-cost ground unit in Vigilance. It's a 2/5, and it's also piloting. So 1 cost, you can pilot it for +1/+2, and attaching it gains on attack. You may heal 2 total damage from any number of units. This one's not bad, honestly. A 1-cost pilot for +1/+2 in terms of stats is definitely on rate. We see a lot of +2/+1s, which I think is generally a little bit better for pilots. But this has the extra effect, I guess you could say, of being able to heal up a little bit of damage here, a little bit of damage there, which is kind of interesting. That is definitely going to be nice with things like Cad Bane, Django, Luke, Skywalker, the new one. These leaders that do this 1/2 ping type sort of damage. It's also going to be really good against indirect damage. I think that's one of these things where maybe these types of cards are actually more sideboard options, and you bring them in and then you just kind of combat indirect damage by healing up your own units with things like Trace. So I think that could have some sort of dynamic. I don't think this is like in a vacuum strong. I think you really need to take advantage of the on attack trigger for it to be good. But I think there is options and there are situations where the on attack trigger will be good. And so we'll just find out if that's going to be relevant. Next up, we got a 2-cost ground unit in Vigilance Heroism. It's a 2/3 rebel. When played, you may give a shield token to a damaged vehicle unit. Of course, this kind of goes for the Trace Martez as well as is it Lando? Is it the new Lando? I think it's the new, Lando's the one. No, it's Rose. The new Rose that heals vehicles. I think this is kind of like along that same process where you are kind of developing this value-oriented outgrind them with my units type deck where you pump them up and then heal them constantly. The problem with these types of situations and strategies is there's a lot of setup and there's a lot of ways it can go wrong. Of course, with the pilot decks that we've been seeing, a lot of them don't require that much setup, and they almost always get their value in just a single attack or a single action, which is really, really important. Whereas these require multiple turns of value, multiple turns of healing, and things like that. So not 100% on board with Echo Base Engineer. Next up, we got Commence Patrol. This is a 1-cost event in Cunning Heroism. It is put another card in a discard pile on the bottom of its owner's deck. If you do, create an X-Wing token. It's pretty straightforward, but I actually think this is interesting. So it says another card in the discard pile because if it didn't say that, you could just do it itself, which means it's just a 1-cost event to create an X-Wing token, which I think would have potential, especially since I've been playing like Wolfpack Escort and things like that, which have been pretty reasonable. But this one says another card. I think this is going to be unlikely to be able to be played on turn 1. It's just not really going to happen unless your opponent goes like Daring Raid or something like that. Or maybe you go Daring Raid and then Commence Patrol, which is honestly a pretty strong turn 1, right? I think this is more of later on in the game to create an extra X-Wing token, but I don't know if it's actually going to be viable later on in the game. I think this is interesting of a card. I don't think it's really applicable that you're taking something from their discard pile, generally speaking. It's got to be the X-Wing token that's doing something. So I think this does have something interesting about it, but I'm not sure if you could really set it up to where you can take advantage of that X-Wing token early enough in the game. Next up, we got Shadowcaster, a 6-cost space unit in Aggression. It's a 4-sided underworld vehicle transport. When a friendly unit is defeated, you may use all of its when defeated abilities again. It's basically just thrown on a body. 6 resource, 4/7 space unit is pretty bad. It doesn't have a specific villainy heroism aspect, which is nice, but it does use the when defeated abilities again, which is interesting because you can go ahead and trigger Thrawn as well, which could be really, really insane. as Thrawn Red is kind of the direction we would want to go. But you're spending 6 resources on a 4/7 that doesn't do anything until you either A, have another unit on the battlefield, or already had another unit to make its when defeated abilities go off 3 times instead of 2, which I don't think that's a good enough payoff for Shadowcaster. It can do some cool things though. Next up, we've got Dogfight, and this one's a really interesting one because it's a 1-cost event in command. You get to attack with a unit, even if it's exhausted, but you can't attack bases. And I think that's really important because if you can attack bases, this is an immediate include in any Sabine deck, in any deck that's aggressive. Can you imagine you just sit there and you like on 6 resources, you get to just play Poe and then you just attack with a unit? Like, that's crazy. Like, you just get to attack your opponent's base. That would be insane, like absolutely insane, right? That's basically timely intervention, but instead of timely, you get to attack their base immediately. So it is an interesting card. I do think it might have potential in certain decks, but most of the time when you're attacking unit to unit, you'll need your unit to survive. And I suppose like turn 1, or you get down a unit, maybe turn 2, you're able to play another 2-drop and then maybe make it immediately attack their 1-drop or something, or their turn 1 play, something like that, to where you can get a little bit of an advantage in the early game. I think later on in the game you get, the worse this thing gets, but maybe there's some value there. I mean, of course, when you have O-Realm cards like Wrecker, you can do some pretty cool stuff with that. I'm not gonna lie, that's pretty cool. Next up, we got Dorsal Turret. This is attached to a vehicle unit for 1-cost command upgrade. Attached unit gains when this unit deals combat damage to a unit while attacking. Defeat that unit. So you basically pay 1 for a way to go ahead and give a vehicle unit Rook's ability. And that is interesting. That is actually decently interesting. It is an upgrade. I think this is the first. Is this the first upgrade that we've seen that is just straight up an upgrade, like not a pilot or anything like that? I think so. And this one, I don't think is like insane, because oftentimes with pilots, you could probably just go out and attack a unit and kill it anyways, and you still will take damage on this unit. But it is a 1-cost upgrade. I mean, maybe there's something there, right? It is combat damage, so you will have to attack each individual unit. You can't use like damage triggers or anything like that. So that's not necessarily the game plan, but Dorsal Turret, maybe there's something there. Next up, we got Scouting Headhunter. This is really interesting because we've got a 2/1 Sentinel in space for 2 resources in command. So one of our, is this, I'll have to pull this up because I keep saying I don't believe there's any like upgrades in Jump to Light Speed, but I don't think that there is a 2-cost Sentinel that is in space. But I'm not 100% sure. Let me pull up the card list. I mean, yeah, we have no 2-cost unit that is a Sentinel in space. So this is the first one. The rest are ground units, right? And there are a few of those, but this is a space unit. I don't think this is particularly good. A lot of opponent space units are going to have 3 toughness, and that means that they should attack it and they don't get their unit removed, which kind of defeats the purpose of the Sentinel. But I mean, maybe there's something there. One of the things with like Pike Sentinel, for example, and the reason why it's been used because it's got a little bit of a higher toughness. This one's got 1 toughness. I mean, not only does it die to like basically anything, it also dies to pings, and that's pretty bad too. So I don't think you're gonna really get a value out of that one. On the other hand, we have another Sentinel in space. It's a 3-cost space unit, contracted Jumpmaster in Cunning Villainy. It's a 2/4 Sentinel, Underworld Vehicle Transport. This one a little bit more interesting. A little bit earlier Sentinel. One of the things that we have in terms of 3-cost Sentinels that we have seen is Black Sun Starfighter. And that one actually is pretty good, but we have 3 power on that, which is pretty relevant. This one is going to be better, of course, against any of those 2 toughness units like Kylo's Silencer, right? This is just such a bad feeling when your opponent plays this type of card into Kylo's Silencer. It blocks your damage and it loses their Silencer and you're left with a unit. Outside of specific scenarios, though, I'm not really seeing this be a widely played, but again, another average common. Next up, we've got In Debt to the Crimson Dawn, and oh my gosh, how many cards do we have? We're only halfway through this, guys. We gotta go faster. 2-cost upgrade, another upgrade here in the new set. Command Villainy. When attached unit readies, exhaust it unless it's a controller plays 2. So essentially a 2-cost upgrade that forces your opponent to play 2 resources every turn. Otherwise, that unit gets exhausted. I think this could act as a nice little tempo play, but it does allow your opponent to keep using that unit if they want to, which I think is a big downside. So I don't think this is going to be super solid, but I think it is like a more temporary removal option, which is decent. Next up, we've got Luke Skywalker. This is a 2-cost ground unit in command heroism. It is a rare. It's a 3/2, but it's got a piloting aspect of 3. And if this upgrade would be defeated, you may instead move him to the ground arena as a unit and exhaust him. So essentially, you pilot onto something. It's a 3/2 or +3/+2. It's got the force tag, which is relevant. It is relevant. It's got the rebel tag and the pilot tag, but this will go ahead and pump up your units a decent amount. And then when it does die, it becomes a 3/2, which is okay. I actually don't think this is that strong of a pilot. Like, yes, you get some value when it goes to the ground, but oftentimes the strength of the pilots plus vehicles that you're going into space and you're dominating that arena. And when you just have this random 3/2 in the ground arena, it's probably just going to die. And it's not really going to give you all that much value, right? And if that was a Chewbacca on your unit, there's a good chance that that unit would have lived. So not a huge fan of Luke Skywalker, but I suppose it's another Luke. Next up, we got Salvage. Play a vehicle unit from your discard pile, then deal 1 damage to it, paying its cost. I don't see this being good at all. Maybe in some sort of Afra deck where you're milling out your whole deck and then suddenly you've got your choice. But you have to play a vehicle unit. You don't get any discount on it, and you have to deal damage to it. It's basically just using your discard pile as another hand for vehicles, which I'm not a huge fan of. I don't think this is very strong at all. Next up, we get another upgrade, 2-cost upgrade in Cunning, attached to a capital ship or transport unit. Very interesting. That unit gains on attack. You may exhaust it on the unit the defending player controls. If you do, deal indirect damage equal to its power to that player. So first thing, you get to exhaust something on attack. That's actually pretty good. Actually, don't mind that one at all. But it is on attack, which is a little bit weak. It doesn't give you any combat stats, just +0, +3. It does make you more tanky. The question is, how many transports do you have? Because capital ships are expensive, right? And if you get a capital ship down, there's probably a good chance that you don't really care about the aspect of exhausting unit and getting indirect damage in, because your capital ships are coming down, you're probably winning the game. In terms of transport, I think this is where it gets a little bit more interesting because you have a lot more early game plays. For example, an immediately readied up Millennium Falcon could be interesting with the super heavy ion cannon. And if you are tempoing them out by constantly exhausting their units and dealing indirect damage, that could actually end up giving you an advantage as you go through the game. Next up, we got Rogue Class Starfighter. This is a 4-cost space unit in Villainy. It's a 4/3 Sentinel in space. That's it. We've seen Black Sun Starfighter. It's a 3/2 Sentinel. I actually think this has potential. Like, it's got potential. It's got enough power to deal with 3/4s, which is what you want. It is going to be a Sentinel in space. I think this can show up similar to how Black Sun Starfighter did show up. I don't think it's impressive by any means. I think only specific decks will want it, and only if the Sentinels in space are actually relevant. Next up, we got Clone Pilot, another very mediocre common. It's a 2-cost ground unit in command for 2/2. It's got piloting of 2. It becomes +2/+2. Kind of a mediocre upgrade overall. It's bad body. Like, you never want to play this as a 2-resource 2/2. It's got pretty mediocre tags with the Republic tag, the Clone tag. +2/+2 for 2 resources is okay, but oftentimes we're seeing +2/+3, so this just seems like a mediocre common. Next up, we've got 3-cost space unit Eager Escort Fighter in command. It's a 4/1 ambusher, which is very interesting, actually, because I see this as more of a removal. You play it on turn 2, you kill their space unit, you move on with your life. It trades. That actually could have some relevance in some more controlling decks, especially as a sideboard card. You put in this in your sideboard, your opponent's playing a space deck. They play Punishing One. You just play this as a removal option, kill their Punishing One, and you're off to the races, right? Not too bad. But I don't think it's really good in any other situation. This one, on the other hand, this one is actually really exciting. This is a 2-cost ground unit, Pantoran Starship Thief. It's in command Villainy. It's 2/2 in terms of stat line, but you don't really care about that because when you play them, you pay 3, or you may pay 3. If you do attach this unit as an upgrade to a fighter or transport unit without a pilot on it, and you just straight up take control of a unit. This is basically more niched down traitorous in terms of traits, but then expanded upon in terms of the cost, right? Because traitorous was any 3 costs or less. This one is any unit at all, as long as it's a fighter or transport. Now, what kind of transports can we get? Well, of course, any of the Millennium Falcons can be good. We can grab Fett's Fire Sprays and things like that, which are pretty nice. In terms of fighters, I mean, there are just I mean, are there expensive fighters? I actually don't even know how many expensive fighters there are. Of course, all the standard early game units like Red 5, Y-Wing, A-Wings, all those things are early game fighters. And I'm just pulling up the card list, and no, there doesn't seem to be that many. But if someone pilots up something or upgrades it, maybe this can go ahead and jump in there and be kind of interesting. Now, the downside is that if they do pilot it up, you're not going to be able to steal that specific unit, but maybe you can go and steal another unit and kill their piloted up unit. Like maybe there's something there. I think this is very interesting, and I do think this has potential as a card similar to Traitorous, but because we don't have that many insane fighters or transports that I'm looking to steal that are going to be really good, I don't know how good Pantoran Starship Thief is. Next up, we got Flanking Fang Fighter. This is a 2/3 colorless 3-resource space unit. It is a unit that says when you control another fighter unit, get rain 2. So it's a 4/3 in space for 3 resources, assuming you've got another fighter unit, which is going to be very, very doable. I'm not sure about this card. I think I'd rather have the 4th toughness. Oftentimes, the 3 toughness is really, really bad on a 3 drop, especially like 7 fleet defenders running around out there. But raid 2 can be relevant. It can get in an extra damage, and that is something you should consider. Next up, we've got Timely Reinforcements, 5-cost event in command. Choose an opponent for every 2 resources they control. You create an X-Wing token, and you give it Sentinel. So if they've got 4 resources, when you're playing this on 5 resources, you get 2 X-Wings, right? Because your opponent, that 5th resource doesn't count. Let's say you're on like 6 or 7 resources, you're going to get 3 X-Wings. Let's say you go up to a little bit further, you can potentially get 8 or 10 X-Wings. I don't really see this being viable at all. Yes, it gives Sentinel. Yes, it'll stall it out, but they're just X-Wing tokens, and then they require so many different actions to use, and I just don't find them to be all that powerful. Next up, we got ATDP Occupier. It's a 4-cost ground unit in aggression. It's a 3/4 Imperial Vehicle Walker. This unit costs 1 less to play for each damaged ground unit. It's got Overwhelm. So this is a pretty bad one, I think, because it says specifically ground units, and I think there are a lot less ground units in a lot of this stuff, especially with set 4 nowadays. Like Jango Red's purely a space deck. It's going to get probably in its same lane, and things like ATDP, I just don't really see a place for. Like if you can play this for 2 resources reliably, a 2 resource 3/4 is not bad, but you're just not going to be able to do that. You're just not. Next up, we've got Razor Crest, and this is probably one of my most exciting units of today. This one is a 4-cost space unit in Cunning. It's a 3/5. It says when a pilot attaches to this unit, you may return a non-linear unit that costs 2 or less, or an exhausted non-linear unit that costs 4 or less, to its owner's hand. So the idea is you get a 3/5 space vehicle, you attach a pilot. When you're playing the Mandalorian leader, you exhaust their unit, then you're able to bounce it, and you get the pilot on the Razor Crest. That is nuts. That's a really powerful 1-2 punch. So definitely something that I'm going to be trying out. I kind of signed up in our tournament as a Mando Red deck, so I might have to add some Razor Crest in there, assuming they're going to be working, but we will find out. Very excited about Razor Crest. Next up, we got War Juggernaut. This one's interesting. A 6-cost ground unit as a 3/7 Republic vehicle tank. It says when playing, you deal 1 damage to each of any number of units, and it gets +1/+0 for each damaged unit. There's not that many units on the battlefield at any given time. I could see this realistically being a 5/7 or 6/7, and then it's just a 5/7 or 6/7 for 6 resources that dealt 1 to a couple different units. Don't think this is necessarily good enough. Next up, we got Twin Laser Turret, 2-cost upgrade in aggression. You attach to a vehicle unit on attack, deal 1 damage to each of up to 2 units in this arena, and you get +2/+2. So +2/+2 is definitely important. The extra minor damage on a couple different units is not bad. But I'd say that most of the time in which it takes to go out and remove them with these types of on-attack triggers is going to be a long time. I do think something like Luke could take advantage of this because you're going to play it on a vehicle. Then you're going to have the backup pings from Luke himself. And then you can actually start to stack pretty nicely, which is okay. But because you have to attach it to a vehicle and because you can't hit ground arenas, I think it's a lot worse. Next up, we've got Air Superiority. If you can control more space units than an opponent, you deal 4 damage to a ground unit that opponent controls. So the idea is you control space, you got no ground units, so you can pay 2 to kill one of their ground units for 4 damage. That's not bad. And I think this does have some potential, especially in those space-based decks where your opponent is swarming on the ground. Next up, we got Silver Angel. This is a 2-cost space unit in Vigilance. It's a 2/3 Fringe Vehicle Transport. When 1 or more damage is healed from this unit, you may deal 1 damage to a space unit. So essentially, Not necessarily a salvage action where you deal 1 damage to your units, you deal 1 damage to the opponent's units, but something similar where you heal 1 damage and you can deal 1 damage to an opposing space unit. A 2/3 for 2 isn't horrible. The fact that you could get some value out of healing is okay. Not something that's going to really happen all that often. And this is the final card I've got for you all. 1 cost event, defeat a non-leader upgrade attached to a unit. If you do, deal 1 damage to that unit. Very straightforward upgrade hate. I think this is definitely playable. I think it's going to be better than Confiscate in certain situations. But of course, Confiscate doesn't say non-leader. So really, really important differentiation. And I think because of that, Confiscate is almost always going to be the go-to when you're looking to put a card in your sideboard for dealing with upgrades. That said, let me know what you think about all these various cards. There's so many because of the draft being showcased today. So let me know what you think. There's just so many to go through that it's definitely going to be a little bit fun when you're drafting. But I'll see you all for tomorrow.